Around the World in 80 Days, by Jules Verne, Chapter 11, in which Phileas Fogg secures a curious means of conveyance at a fabulous price. The train had started punctually. Among the passengers were a number of officers, government officials, and opium and indigo merchants, whose business called them into the eastern coast. Passepartout rode in the same carriage with his master. A third passenger occupied a seat to them. This was Sir Francis Cromarty, one of Mr. Fogg's whist partners on the Mongolia, now on his way to join his corps at Benares. Sir Francis was a tall, fair man of 50 who had greatly distinguished himself at the last Sepoy revolt. He made India his home, only paying brief visits to England at rare intervals, and was almost as familiar as a native with the customs, history, and character of India and its people. But Phileas Fogg, who was not travelling, but only describing a circumference, took no pains to inquire into these subjects. He was a solid body, traversing an orbit around the terrestrial globe. According to the laws of rational mechanics, he was at this moment calculating in his mind the number of hours spent since his departure from London, and, had it been in his nature to make a useless demonstration, he would have rubbed his hands for satisfaction. Sir Francis Cromarty had observed the oddity of his travelling companion, though the only opportunity he had for studying him had been while he was dealing the cards, and between two rubbers, and questioned himself whether a human heart really beat beneath this cold exterior, and whether Phileas Fogg had any sense of the beauties of nature. The Brigadier General was free to mentally confess that, of all the eccentric persons he had ever met, none was comparable to the product of this exact sciences. Phileas Fogg had not concealed from Sir Francis his design of going around the world, nor the circumstances under which he set out, and the General only saw in the wager a useless eccentricity and a lack of sound common sense. In the way this strange gentleman was going on, he would leave the world without having done any good to himself or anybody else. An hour after leaving Bombay, the train had passed the viaducts and the island of Salsette, and had gone into the open country. At Calvan they reached the junction of the branch line which descends towards southeastern India by Kandala and Poona, and, passing Palwell, they entered the defiles of the mountains with their basalt bases and their summits crowned with thick and verdant forests. Phileas Fogg and now Sir Francis Cromarty exchanged a few words from time to time, and now Sir Francis, reviving the conversation, observed, "Some years ago, Mr. Fogg, you would have met with delay at this point, which would have probably cost you your wager." "How so, Mr. Francis?" "Because the railway stopped at the base of these mountains, which all the passengers were obliged to cross in palanquins or ponies to Kandala on the other side." "Such a delay would have not deranged my plans in the least," said Mr. Fogg. "I have constantly foreseen the likelihood of certain obstacles." "But, Mr. Fogg," pursued Sir Francis, "you run the risk of having some difficulty about this worthy fellow's adventure at the pagoda." Passepartout, his feet comfortably wrapped in his travelling blanket, was sound asleep and did not dream that anybody was talking about him. "The government is very severe upon that kind of offence. It takes particular care that the religious customs of the Indians should be respected, and if your servant were caught—" "Very well, Sir Francis," replied Mr. Fogg. "If he had been caught, he would have been condemned and punished, then he would have quietly returned to Europe. I don't see how this affair could have delayed his master." The conversation fell again. During the night the train left the mountains behind and passed Nasik, and the next day proceeded over the flat, well-cultivated country of the Khandish, with its straggling villages, above which rose the minarets of the pagodas. This fertile territory is watered by numerous small rivers and limpid streams, mostly tributaries of the Godavery. Passepartout, on waking and looking out, could not realize that he was actually crossing India in a railway train. The locomotive, guided by an English engineer and fed with English coal, threw out its smoke upon cotton, coffee, nutmeg, clove, and pepper plantations, while the steam curled in spirals around groups of palm trees, in the midst of which were seen picturesque bungalows, viharis, sort of abandoned monasteries, and marvelous temples enriched by the exhaustless ornamentation of Indian architecture. Then they came upon vast tracts extending to the horizon, with jungles inhabited by snakes and tigers, which fled at the noise of the train, succeeded by forest penetrating by the railway, and still haunted by elephants which, with pensive eyes, gazed at the train as it passed. The travellers crossed, beyond Milligam, the fatal country so often stained with the blood by the sectaries of the goddess Kali. Not far off rose Allura, with its graceful pagodas, and the famous Aurungabad, capital of the ferocious Aurangzeb, now the chief town in one of the detached provinces of the kingdom of the Nizam. It was thereabouts that Feringe, the thuggy chief, king of stranglers, held his sway. Those ruffians, united by a secret bond, strangled victims of every age in honor of the goddess Death, without ever shedding blood. There was a period when this part of the country could scarcely be travelled over without corpses being found in every direction. The English government has succeeded in greatly diminishing these murders, though the thuggies still exist and pursue the exercise of their horrible rights. At 12:30, the train stopped in Burhampur, where Passepartout was able to purchase some Indian slippers, ornamented with false pearls, in which, with evident vanity, he proceeded to encase his feet. The travellers made a hasty breakfast and started off for Asaugur, after skirting for a little the banks of the small river Tapti, which empties into the Gulf of Cambrai near Surat. Passepartout was now plunged into the absorbing revelry. Up to his arrival at Bombay, he had entertained hopes that their journey would end there. But now that they were plainly whirling across India at full speed, a sudden change had come over the spirit of his dreams. His old vagabond nature returned to him. The fantastic idea of his youth once more took possession of him. He came to regard his master's project as intended in good earnest, believed in the reality of the bet, and therefore in the tour of the world, and the necessity of making it without fail within the designated period. Already he began to worry about possible delays and accidents which might happen along the way. He recognized himself as being personally interested in the wager, and trembled at the thought that he might have been the means of losing it by his unpardonable folly of the night before. Being much less cool-headed than Mr. Fogg, he was much more restless, counting and recounting the days passed over, uttering maledictions when the train stopped and accusing it of sluggishness, and mentally blaming Mr. Fogg for not having bribed the engineer. The worthy fellow was ignorant that, while it was possible by such means to hasten the rate of a steamer, it could not be done on the railway. The train entered the defiles of the Suptor Mountains, which separate the Khandish from Bundelkund, towards evening. The next day Sir Francis Cromarty asked Passepartout what time it is, to which, on consulting his watch, he replied that it was 3 a.m. This famous timepiece, always regulated on the Greenwich meridian, which was now some 76 degrees westward, was at least 4 hours slow. Sir Francis corrected Passepartout's time, whereupon the latter made the same remark that he had done to Fix, and upon the General insisting that the watch should be regulated in each new meridian, since he was constantly going eastward. That is, in the face of the sun, and therefore the days were shorter by 4 minutes for each degree gone over. Passepartout obstinately refused to alter his watch, which he kept at London time. It was an innocent delusion which could harm no one. The train stopped at 8 o'clock, in the midst of a glade some 15 miles beyond Rothal, where there were several bungalows and workmen's cabins. The conductor, passing along the carriages, shouted, "Passengers will get out here!" Phileas Fogg looked at Sir Francis Cromarty for an explanation, but the General could not tell what it meant at a halt in the middle of this forest of dates and acacias. Passepartout, not less surprised, rushed out and speedily returned, crying, "Monsieur, no more railway?"
"What do you mean?"
asked Sir Francis. "I mean to say that the train isn't going on." The General at once stepped out, while Phileas Fogg calmly followed behind him, and they proceeded together to the conductor.
"Where are we?"
asked Sir Francis.
"At the hamlet of Kobe."
"Do we stop here?"
"Certainly. The railway isn't finished."
"What? Not finished?"
"No. It's still a matter of 50 miles to be laid from here to Allahabad, where the line begins again."
"But the papers announced the opening of the railway throughout."
"What would you have, officer? The papers were mistaken."
"You sell tickets from Bombay to Calcutta," retorted Sir Francis, who was growing warm.
"No doubt," replied the conductor, "but the passengers know that they must provide means of transportation from themselves from Colby to Allahabad."
Sir Francis was furious. Passepartout would willingly have knocked out the conductor down, and did not dare look at his master. "We will, if you please, look about for some means of conveyance to Allahabad."
"Mr. Fogg, this is a delay greatly to your disadvantage."
"No, Sir Francis, it was foreseen."
"What? You knew that the way—"
"No, not at all. But I knew some obstacle or other would sooner or later arise in my route. Nothing, therefore, is lost. I have 2 days, which I have already gained, to sacrifice. A steamer leaves Calcutta for Hong Kong at noon. On the 25th, This is the 22nd, and we shall reach Calcutta in time." There was nothing to say to so confident a response. But it was too true that the railway came to a termination at this point. The papers were like some watches, which have a way of getting too fast, and had been premature in their announcement of the completion of the line. The greater part of the travellers were aware of this interruption, and, leaving the train, they began to engage such vehicles as the village could provide: four-wheel plak-garis, wagons drawn by zebus, carriages that looked like perambulating pagodas, palanquins, ponies, and what-not. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, after searching the village from end to end, came back without having found anything. "I shall go afoot," said Phileas Fogg. Passepartout, who now had rejoined his master, made a wry grimace, as he thought of his magnificent but too frail Indian shoes. Happily, he too had been looking about him, and after a moment's hesitation said, "Monsieur, I think I have found the means of conveyance." "What?" An elephant that belongs to an Indian who lives but 100 steps from here." "Let's go see the elephant," replied Mr. Fogg. As soon as they reached a small hut near which, enclosed within some high palings, was the animal in question, an Indian came out of the hut, and, at their request, conducted them within the enclosure. The elephant, which the owner had reared, not for beast of burden, but for warlike purposes, was half domesticated. The Indian had begun already, by often irritating him, and feeding him every 3 months on sugar and butter, to impart him with a ferocity not in his nature. This method being often employed by those who trained the Indian elephants for battle. Happily, however, for Mr. Fogg, the animal's instruction in this direction had not gone far, and the elephant still preserved his natural gentleness. Kioni, this was the name of the beast, could doubtless travel rapidly for a long time, and, in default, or of any other means of conveyance, Mr. Fogg resolved to hire him. But elephants are far from cheap in India, where they are becoming scarce. The males, which are alone suitable for circus shows, are much sought, especially, but as few of them are domesticated. When therefore Mr. Fogg proposed to the Indian to hire Kioni, he refused point blank. Mr. Fogg persisted, offering an excessive sum of £10 an hour for the loan of the beast to Allahabad. Refused. £20. Refused. Also. £40. Still refused. Passepartout jumped at each advanced, but the Indian declined to be tempted. Yet the offer was an alluring one, for supposing it took the elephant 15 hours to reach Allahabad, his owner would receive no less than £600 sterling. Phileas Fogg, without getting in the least flurried, then proposed to purchase the animal outright, and at first offered £1,000 for him. The Indian, perhaps thinking he was going to make a great bargain, still refused. Sir Francis Cromarty took Mr. Fogg aside, and begged him to reflect more before he went any further, to which that gentleman replied that he was not in the habit of acting rashly, that a bet of £20,000 was at stake, and that the elephant was absolutely necessary to him, and that he would secure him if he had to pay 20 times his value. Returning to the Indian, whose small, sharp eyes glistened with avarice, betrayed that with him it was only a question of how great a price he could obtain. Mr. Fogg offered first £1,200, then £1,500, £1,800, £2,000. Passepartout, usually so rubicund, was fairly white with suspense. At £2,000 the Indian yielded. "What a price, good heavens!" cried Passepartout, "for an elephant!" It only remained now to find a guide, which was comparatively easy. A young Parsee with an intelligent face offered his services, which Mr. Fogg accepted, promising so generous a reward as to materially stimulate his zeal. The elephant was led out and equipped. The Parsee, who was an accomplished elephant driver, covered his back with sort of a saddle-cloth, and attached to each of his flanks some curiously uncomfortable howdahs. Phileas Fogg paid the Indian with some banknotes which he extracted from the famous carpet-bag, a proceeding that seemed to deprive poor Passepartout of his vitals. Then he offered to carry Sir Francis to Allahabad, which the Brigadier gratefully accepted. As one traveller the more would not be likely to fatigue the gigantic beast. Provisions were purchased at Colby, and while Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg took the howdahs on either side, Passepartout got astride the saddle-cloth between them. The Parsee perched himself on the elephant's neck, and at 9 o'clock they set out from the village, the animal marching off through the dense forest of the palms by the shortest cut. End of Chapter 11. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days, by Jules Verne. Chapter 12, in which Phileas Fogg and his companions venture across the Indian forests, and what ensued. In order to shorten their journey, the guide passed to the left of the line where the railway was still in process of being built. This line, owing to the capricious turnings of the Vindalia Mountains, did not pursue a straight course. The Parsee, who was quite familiar with the roads and paths in the district, declared that they would gain 20 miles by striking directly through the forest. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, plunged to the neck of the peculiar howdahs provided for them, were horribly jostled by the swift trotting of the elephant, spurred on as he was by the skilful Parsee. But they endured the discomfort with true British phlegm, talking little, and scarcely able to catch a glimpse of each other. As for Passepartout, who was mounted on the beast's back, and received the direct force of each concussion as he trod along, he was very careful, in accordance with his master's advice, to keep his tongue from between his teeth, as it would otherwise have been bitten off. The worthy fellow bounced from the elephant's neck to his rump, and vaulted like a clown on a springboard, yet he laughed in the midst of his bouncing, and from time to time took a piece of sugar out of his pocket and inserted it in Keone's trunk, who received it without the least slackening of his regular trot. After 2 hours the guide stopped the elephant, and gave him an hour for rest, during which Keone, after quenching his thirst at a neighbouring spring, set to devouring the branches and shrubs around him. Neither Sir Francis nor Mr. Fogg regretted the delay, and both descended with a feeling of relief. "Why, he's made of iron!" exclaimed the General, gazing admirably on Keone. "Of forged iron," replied Passepartout, as he set about preparing a hasty breakfast. At noon the Parsee gave the signal of departure. The country soon presented a very savage aspect. Copses of dates and dwarf palms succeeded the dense forests, then vast dry plains dotted with scanty shrubs, and sown with great blocks of siennet. All this portion of Bundelkund, which is little frequented by travellers, is inhabited by a fanatical population, hardened in the most horrible practices of the Hindu faith. The English have not yet begun to secure a complete dominion over this territory, which is subjected to the influence of Rajas, who it is almost impossible to reach in their inaccessible mountain fastness. The travellers several times saw bands of ferocious Indians, who, when they perceived the elephant striding cross-country, made angry, arid, threatening motions. The Parsee avoided them as much as possible. Few animals were observed on the route. Even the monkeys hurried from their path with contortions and grimaces which convulsed Passepartout with laughter. In the midst of his gaiety, however, one thought troubled the worthy servant. What would Mr. Fogg do with the elephant when he got to Allahabad? Would he carry it on with him? Impossible. The cost of transporting him would make him ruinously expensive. Would he sell him or set him free? The estimable beast certainly deserved some consideration. Should Mr. Fogg choose to make him, Passepartout, a present of Keone, he would much be very embarrassed, and these thoughts did not cease worrying him for a long time. The principal chain of the Vindhyas was crossed by 8 in the evening. Another halt was made on the northern slope, in a ruined bungalow. They had gone nearly 25 miles that day, and equal distance still separated them from the station of Allahabad. The night was cold. The Parsee lit a fire in the bungalow with a few dry branches, and the warmth was very grateful. Provisions purchased at Colby sufficed for supper, and the travellers ate ravenously. The conversation, beginning with a few disconnected phrases, soon gave place to loud and steady snores. The guide watched Keone, who slept standing, bolstering himself against the trunk of a large tree. Nothing occurred during the night to disturb the slumbers, although the occasional growls from panthers and chatterings of monkeys broke the silence. The more formidable beasts made no cries or hostile demonstration against the occupants of the bungalow. Sir Francis slept heavily, like an honest soldier overcome with fatigue. Passepartout was wrapped in the uneasy dreams of bouncing the day before. As for Mr. Fogg, he slumbered as peacefully as if he had been in a serene mansion on Savile Row. The journey was resumed at 6 in the morning. The guide hoped to reach Allahabad by the evening. In that case, Mr. Fogg would only lose a part of 48 hours saved since the beginning of the tour. Keone, resuming his rapid gait, soon descended the lower spurs of the Vindhyas, and towards noon they passed the village of Callender, on the Kenny, one of the branches of the Ganges. The guide avoided inhabited places, thinking it safer to keep the open country, which lies along the first depressions of the basin of the great river. Allahabad was now only 12 miles to the northeast. They stopped under a clump of bananas, the fruit of which was healthy as bread, as succulent as cream, and amply partaken of and appreciated. At 2 o'clock the guide entered a thick forest, which extended several miles. He preferred to travel under the cover of the woods. They had not as yet had any unpleasant encounters, and the journey seemed on the point of being successfully accomplished, when the elephant, becoming restless, suddenly stopped, when it was the 4 o'clock.
"What's the matter?"
asked Sir Francis, putting out his head.
"I don't know, officer,"
replied the Parsee, listening attentively to a confused murmur which came through the thick branches. The murmur soon became more distinct. It now seemed like a distant concert of human voices accompanied by brass instruments. Passepartout was all eyes and ears. Mr. Fogg patiently waited without a word. The Parsee jumped to the ground, fastened the elephant to a tree, and plunged into the thicket. He soon returned, saying, "A procession of Brahmins is coming this way. We must prevent their seeing us if possible." The guide unloosed the elephant and led him into a thicket, at the same time asking the travellers not to stir. He held himself ready to bestride the animal at a moment's notice, should flight become necessary. But he evidently thought that the procession of the faithful would pass without perceiving them amid the thick foliage, which they were wholly concealed. The discordant tones of the voices and instruments drew nearer. Now droning songs mingled with the sound of tambourines and cymbals. The head of the procession soon appeared beneath the trees, 100 paces away, and the strange figures who performed the religious ceremony were easily distinguished through the branches. First came the priests, with mitres on their head and clothed in long lace robes. They were surrounded by men, women, and children, who sang a kind of lugubrious psalm, interrupted at regular intervals by the tambourines and cymbals, while behind them was drawn a car with large wheels, the spokes of which represented serpents entwined within each other. Upon the car, which was drawn by 4 richly caparisoned zebus, stood a hideous statue with 4 arms, the body coloured dull red, with haggard eyes, dishevelled hair, protruding tongue, and lips tinted with betel. It stood upright upon the figure of a prostrate and headless giant. Sir Francis, recognizing the statue, whispered, "The goddess Kali, the goddess of love and death." "Of death, perhaps," muttered back Passepartout, "but of love? That ugly old hag? Never." The Parsee made a motion to keep silence. A group of old fakirs were capering and making a wild ado around the statue. These were striped with ochre and covered with the cuts whence their blood issued drop by drop. Stupid fanatics, who in the great Indian ceremonies still throw themselves under the wheels of Juggernaut. Some Brahmins, clad in all the sumptuous of Oriental apparel, and leading a woman who faltered at every step, followed. This woman was young, and as fair as European. Her neck and head, shoulders, ears, arms, hands, and toes were loaded down with jewels and gems, with bracelets, earrings, and rings, while a tunic bordered with gold and covered with a light muslin robe betrayed the outline of her form. The guards who followed the young woman presented a violent contrast to her. Armed they were with naked sabres hung at their waists, and long Damascene pistols, bearing a corpse on a palanquin. It was the body of an old man, gorgeously arrayed in the habiliments of a Rajah, wearing, as in life, a turban embroidered with pearls, a robe of tissue and silk and gold, a scarf of cashmere sewed with diamonds, and the magnificent weapon of a Hindu prince. Next came the musicians, and a rear guard of capering fakirs, whose cries sometimes drowned out the noise of instruments. These closed the procession. Sir Francis watched the procession with a sad countenance, and, turning to the guide, said, "A suttee." The Parsee nodded, and put a finger to his lips. The procession slowly wound under the trees, and soon its last ranks disappeared in the depths of the wood. The songs gradually died away. Occasionally cries were heard in the distance, until at last all was silence again. Phileas Fogg had heard what Sir Francis said, and as soon as the procession had disappeared, asks, "What's a suttee?"
"A suttee," returned the General, "is a human sacrifice, but a voluntary one. The woman you have just seen will be burned tomorrow at the dawn of day."
"Oh, the scoundrels!" cried the Passepartout, who could not repress his indignation. "And the corpse?" asked Mr. Fogg.
"Is that of the prince, her husband," said the guide, "an independent Rajah of Bundelkund."
"Is it possible," resumed Phileas Fogg, his voice betraying not the least emotion, "that these barbarous customs still exist in India, and the English have been unable to put a stop to them?"
"These sacrifices do not occur in the larger portion of India," replied Sir Francis, "but we have no power over these savage territories, and especially here in Bundelkund, the whole district north of the Vendiers is the theatre of incessant murders and pillage."
"The poor wretch," exclaimed Passepartout, "to be burned alive!"
"Yes," returned Sir Francis, "burned alive, and, if she were not, you cannot conceive what a treatment she would be obliged to submit for from her relatives. They would shave off her hair, feed her a scanty allowance of rice, treat her with contempt. She would be looked upon as an unclean creature. She would die in some corner like a scurvy dog. The prospect of so frightful existence drives these poor creatures to the sacrifice of much more than love or religious fanaticism. Sometimes, however, the sacrifice is really voluntary, and it requires the active interference of the government to prevent it. Several years ago, when I was living at Bombay, a young widow asked permission of the governor to be burned along with her husband's body, but as you may imagine, he refused. The woman left town and took refuge with an independent Rajah, and there carried out her self-devoted purpose. While Sir Francis was speaking, the guide shook his head several times and now said, "The sacrifice which will take place tomorrow at dawn is not a voluntary one." "How do you know?" "Everybody knows about this affair in Bundelkund." "But the wretched creature did not seem to be making any resistance," observed Sir Francis. "That was because they had intoxicated her with fumes of hemp and opium. But where are they taking her?" "To the pagoda of the Pelage, 2 miles from here. She will pass the night there." "And the sacrifice will take place tomorrow, at the first light of dawn." The guide now led the elephant out of the thicket, and leaped upon his neck. Just at the moment when he was about to urge Kearney forward with a particular whistle, Mr. Fogg stopped him, and turning to Sir Francis Cromarty, said, "Suppose we save this woman." "Save the woman, Mr. Fogg?" "I yet have 12 hours to spare. I can devote them to that." "Why, you are a man of heart." "Sometimes," replied Phileas Fogg quietly, "when I have the time." End of Chapter 12. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 13, in which Passepartout receives a new proof that fortune favors the brave. The project was a bold one, full of difficulty, perhaps impracticable. Mr. Fogg was going to risk life, or at least liberty, and therefore the success of his tour, but he did not hesitate, and he found in Sir Francis Cromarty an enthusiastic ally. As for Passepartout, he was ready for anything that might be proposed. His master's idea charmed him. He perceived a heart, a soul under that icy exterior. He began to love Phileas Fogg. There remained the guide. What course would he adopt? Would he not take part with the Indians? In default of his assistance, it was necessary to be assured of his neutrality. Sir Francis frankly put the question to him. "Officer," replied the guide, "I am a Parsee, and this woman is a Parsee. Command me as you will." "Excellent," said Mr. Fogg. "However," resumed the guide, "it is certain not only that we will risk our lives, but the horrible tortures if we are taken." "That is foreseen," replied Mr. Fogg. "I think we must wait till nightfall before acting." "I think so." The worthy Indian then gave some account of the victim, who, he said, was a celebrated beauty of the Parsee race, and the daughter of a wealthy Bombay merchant. She had received a thoroughly English education in that city, and from her manners and intelligence was thought to be a European. Her name was Aouda. Left an orphan, she was married against her will to the old Rajah of Bundelkund, and, knowing the fate that awaited her, she escaped, was retaken and devoted by the Rajah's relatives, who had an interest in her death, to the sacrifice from which it seemed she could not escape. The Parsee's narrative only confirmed Mr. Fogg's and his companions in their generous design. It was decided that the guide should direct the elephant towards the pagoda of the Pelage, after which he accordingly approached as quickly as possible. They halted, half an hour afterwards, in a copse some 500 feet from the pagoda, where they were well concealed. They could hear the groans and cries of the fakirs distinctly. Then they discussed the means of getting the victim. The guide was familiar with the pagoda of the Pelage, in which, as he declared, the young woman was imprisoned. Could they enter any of its doors while the whole party of Indians was plunged in a drunken sleep, or was it safer to attempt to make a hole in the walls? This could only be determined at the moment and the place themselves, but it was certain that the abduction must be made at night, and not when, at break of day, the victim was to be led to her funeral pyre. Then no human intervention could save her. As soon as night fell, about 6 o'clock, they decided to make a reconnaissance around the pagoda. The cries of the fakirs were just ceasing. The Indians were in the act of plunging themselves into the drunkenness caused by liquid opium mingled with hemp, and it might be possible to slip between them to the temple itself. The Parsee, leading the others,
noiselessly crept through the wood, and in 10 minutes they found themselves on the banks of a small stream, whence, by the light of the rosin torches, they perceived a pyre of wood, on top of which lay the embalmed body of the Rajah, who was to be burned with his wife. The pagoda, whose minarets loomed above the trees in the deepening dusk, stood 100 steps away. "Come," whispered the guide. He slipped more cautiously than ever through the brush, followed by his companions. The silence around was only broken by the low murmuring of the wind among the branches. Soon the Parsi stopped on the borders of the glade, which was lit up by the torches. The ground was covered by the groups of Indians, motionless in their drunken sleep. It seemed a battlefield strewn with the dead. Men, women, and children lay together. In the background, among the trees, the pagoda of the Palaji loomed distinctly. Much to the guide's disappointment, the guards of the Rajah, lighted by torches, were watching at the doors and marching to and fro with naked sabres. Probably the priests, too, were watching within. The Parsi, now convinced that it was impossible to force an entrance to the temple, advanced no farther, but led his companions back again. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty also saw that nothing could be attempted in that direction. They stopped and engaged in a whispered colloquy.
"It's only 8 now," said the Brigadier, "and these guards may also go to sleep." "It is not impossible," returned the Parsi.
They lay down at the foot of a tree and waited. The time seemed long. The guide ever and anon left them to take an observation on the edge of the wood, but the guards watched steadily by the glare of the torches, and a dim light crept through the windows of the pagoda. They waited until midnight, but no change took place among the guards, and it became apparent that their yielding to sleep could not be counted on. The other plan must be carried out. An opening in the walls of the pagoda must be made. It remained to ascertain whether the priests were watching by the side of their victim as assiduously as the guards were at the door. After a last consultation, the guide announced that he was ready for the attempt and advanced, followed by the others. They took a roundabout way so as to get the pagoda on the rear. They reached the walls about 12:30. Without having met anyone, there was no guard. There were neither windows or doors. The night was dark. The moon, on the wane, scarcely left the horizon, and was covered with heavy clouds. The height of the trees deepened the darkness. It was not enough to reach the walls. An opening in them must be accomplished, and to attain this purpose the party only had their pocket-knives. Happily, the temple walls were built of brick and wood, which could be penetrated with little difficulty. After one brick had been taken out, the rest would yield easily. They set noiselessly to work, and the Parsi on one side and Passepartout on the other began to loosen the brick so as to make a sudden aperture 2 feet wide. They were getting on rapidly when suddenly a cry was heard in the interior of the temple, followed almost instantly by other cries replying from the outside. Passepartout and the guide had stopped. Had they been heard? Was the alarm being given? Common prudence urged them to retire, and they did so, followed by Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis. They again hid themselves in the wood, and waited till the disturbance, whatever it may be, ceased, holding themselves ready to resume their attempt without delay. But awkwardly enough, the guards now appeared at the rear of the temple, and there installed themselves in readiness to prevent a surprise. It would be difficult to describe the disappointment of the party. Thus interrupted in their work, they could now not reach the victim. How, then, could they save her? Sir Francis shook his fists. Passepartout was beside himself, and the guide gnashed his teeth with rage. The tranquil Fogg waited, without betraying any emotion.
"We have nothing to do but to go away," whispered Sir Francis.
"Nothing but to go away," echoed the guide. "Stop," said Fogg. "I'm only due at Allahabad before tomorrow noon."
"But what can you hope to do?" asked Sir Francis.
"In a few hours it will be daylight, and the chance which now seems lost may present itself at the last moment." Sir Francis would have liked to read Phileas Fogg's eyes. What was this cool Englishman thinking of? Was he planning to make a rush for the young woman at the very moment of the sacrifice, and boldly snatch her from her executioners? This would be utter folly, and it was hard to admit that Fogg was such a fool. Sir Francis consented, however, to remain to the end of this terrible drama. The guide led them to the rear of the glade, where they were able to observe the sleeping groups. Meanwhile, Passepartout, who had perched himself on the lower branches of a tree, was resolving an idea which first struck him in like a flash, and which was now firmly lodged in his brain. He had commenced by saying to himself, "What folly?" and then he repeated, "Why not, after all? It's a chance, perhaps the only one, and with such sorts." Thinking thus, he slipped, with the suppleness of a serpent, to the lowest branches, the ends of which bent almost to the ground. The hours passed, and the lighter shades now announced the approach of day. though was not yet light. This was the moment. The slumbering multitude became animated. The tambourines sounded, songs and cries arose. The hour of the sacrifice had come. The doors of the pagoda swung open, and a bright light escaped from its interior, in the midst of which Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis espied the victim. She seemed, having shaken off the stupor of intoxication, to be striving to escape from her executioner. Sir Francis's heart throbbed, and convulsively seizing Mr. Fogg's hand, found in it an open knife. Just at this moment the crowd began to move. The young woman had again fallen into stupor caused by the fumes of hemp passed among the fakirs, who escorted her with wild religious cries. Phileas Fogg and his companions, mingling in the rear ranks of the crowd, followed, and in 2 minutes they reached the banks of the stream and stopped 50 paces from the pyre, upon which still lay the Rajah's corpse. In the semi-obscurity they saw the victim, quite senseless, stretched out beside her husband's body. Then a torch was brought, and the wood, heavily soaked with oil, instantly took fire. At this moment, Sir Francis and the guides seized Phileas Fogg, who in an instant of mad generosity was about to rush upon the pyre. But he had quickly pushed them aside, when the whole scene suddenly changed. A cry of terror rose. The whole multitude prostrated themselves, terror-stricken on the ground. The old Rajah was not dead. Then, since he rose all of a sudden, like a spectre, took up the wife in his arms, and descended from the pyre in the midst of the clouds of smoke, which only heightened his ghostly appearance. Fakirs and soldiers and priests, seized with instant terror, lay there, with their faces on the ground, not daring to lift their eyes and behold such a prodigy. The inanimate victim was borne alone by the vigorous arms which supported her, and which she did not seem in the least to burden. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis stood erect. The Parsi bowed his head, and Passepartout was no doubt scarcely less stupefied. The resuscitated Rajah approached Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg, and in an abrupt tone said, "Let us be off." It was Passepartout himself, who had slipped upon the pyre in the midst of the smoke, and, profiting by the still overhanging darkness, had delivered the young woman from death. It was Passepartout who, playing his part with a happy audacity, had passed through the crowd amid the general terror. A moment after all 4 of the party had disappeared in the woods, and the elephant was bearing them away at a rapid pace, the cries and noise, and a ball which whizzed through Phileas Fogg's hat, apprised them that the trick had been discovered. The old Rajah's body, indeed, now appeared upon the burning pyre, and the priests, recovered from their terror, perceived that an abduction had taken place. They hastened into the forest, followed by the soldiers, who fired a volley after the fugitives. But the latter rapidly increased the distance between them, and ere long found themselves beyond the reach of bullets and arrows. End of Chapter 13. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 14, in which Phileas Fogg descends the whole length of the beautiful Valley of Ganges without ever thinking of seeing it. The rash exploit had been accomplished. For an hour Passepartout laughed gaily at his success. Sir Francis pressed the worthy fellow's hand, and his master said, "Well done," which from him was high commendation, to which Passepartout replied that all the credit of the affair belonged to Mr. Fogg. As for him, he had only been struck with a queer idea, and he laughed to think that for a few moments he, Passepartout, the ex-gymnast, ex-sergeant fireman, had been the spouse of a charming woman, a venerable embalmed Rajah. As for the young Indian woman, she had been unconscious throughout what was passing, and now, wrapped up in a travelling blanket, was reposing in one of the howdahs. The elephant, thanks to the skilful guidance of the Parsi, was advancing rapidly through the still darksome forest, and, an hour after leaving the pagoda, had crossed a vast plain. They made a halt at 7 o'clock, the young woman being still in a state of complete prostration. The guide made her drink a little brandy and water, but the drowsiness which stupefied her could not be shaken off. Sir Francis, who was familiar with the effects of intoxication produced by the fumes of hemp, reassured his companions on her account. But he was more disturbed at the prospect of her future fate. He told Phileas Fogg that, should Aouda remain in India, she would inevitably fall again into the hands of her executioners. These fanatics were scattered throughout the country, and would, despite the English police, recover their victim at Madras, Bombay, or Calcutta. She could only be safe by quitting India forever. Phileas Fogg replied that he would reflect upon the matter. The station at Allahabad was reached about 10 o'clock, and the interrupted line of railway being resumed would enable them just to reach Calcutta in less than 24 hours. Phileas Fogg would thus be able to arrive in time to take the steamer which left Calcutta on the next day, October 25th, at noon for Hong Kong. The young woman was placed in one of the waiting rooms of the station, whilst Passepartout was charged with purchasing for her various articles of toilette, a dress shawl and some furs, for which his master gave him unlimited credit. Passepartout started off forthwith and found himself in the streets of Allahabad, that is, the City of God, one of the most venerated in India, being built at the junction of two sacred rivers, Ganges and Jumna, the waters of which attract pilgrims from every part of the peninsula. The Ganges, according to the legends of the Ramayana, rises in heaven, whence, owing to Brahma's agency, it descends to the earth. Passepartout made it a point, as he makes his purchases, to take a good look at the city. It was formerly defended by a noble fort, which has since become a state prison. Its commerce has dwindled away, and Passepartout in vain looked about for him such a bazaar as he used to frequent in Regent Street. At last he came upon an elderly crusty Jew, who sold second-hand articles, from whom he purchased a dress of Scotch stuff, a large mantle, a fine otter-skin pelisse, for which he did not hesitate to pay £75, and then he returned triumphantly to the station. The influence to which the priests of Pelagie had subjected Ouida began to gradually yield. She became more herself, so that her fine eyes resumed all their soft Indian expression. When the poet-king Ukafu Daul celebrates the charms of the queen of Ahmedangara, he speaks thus: Her shining tresses, divided in two parts, encircle the harmonious contour of her white and delicate cheeks. Brilliant in their glow and freshness, her ebony brows have the form and charm of the bow of Kama, the god of love, and beneath her long silken lashes the purest reflections and celestial lights swim, as in the sacred lakes of the Himalaya. In the black pupils of her great clear eyes, her teeth, fine, equal, and white, glitter between her smiling lips like dewdrops in a passion flower's half-enveloped breast. Her delicately formed ears, her vermilion hands, her little feet curved and tender, as the lotus bud glitter with the brilliancy of the loveliest pearls of the Ceylon. The most dazzling diamonds of Golconda, her narrow and supple waist, which a hand may clasp around, sets forth the outline of her rounded figure and the beauty of her bosom, where youth in its flower displays the wealth of its treasures, and beneath the silken folds of her tunic she seems to have been moulded in pure silver by the godlike hand of Vikrakama, the immortal sculptor. It is enough to say, without applying this poetical rhapsody to Aouda, that she was a charming woman. In all the European acception of the phrase, she spoke English with great purity, and the guide had not exaggerated in saying that the young Parsi had been transformed by her bringing up. The train was about to start from Allahabad, and Mr. Fogg proceeded to pay the guide the price agreed upon for his service, and not a farthing more, which astonished Passepartout, who remembered all his master owed to the guide's devotion. He had, indeed, risked his life in the adventure at the Pelagie, and if he should be caught afterwards by the Indians, he would with difficulty escape their vengeance. Keone must be disposed of, but what should be done with the elephant, which he had so dearly purchased? Phileas Fogg had already determined this question. Parsi, he said to the guide, you have been serviceable and devoted. I have paid for your service, but not for your devotion. Would you like to have this elephant? He is yours. The guide's eyes glistened. Your honour is giving me a fortune, cried he. Take him, guide, returned Mr. Fogg, and I shall still be your debtor. Good, exclaimed Passepartout. Take him, friend. Curly is a brave and faithful beast. And going up to the elephant, he gave him several lumps of sugar, saying, Here, Curly, here. The elephant grunted out of his satisfaction, and clasping Passepartout around the waist with his trunk, lifted him as high as his head. Passepartout, not the least of arm, caressed the animal, which replaced him gently on the ground. Soon after, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout, installed in a carriage with Aouda, who had the best seat, were whirling at full speeds towards Benares. It was a run of 80 miles, and was accomplished in 2 hours. During the journey, the young woman fully recovered her senses. What was her astonishment to find herself in this carriage, on the railway, dressed in European habiliments, and with travellers who were quite strangers to her. Her companions first set about fully reviving her with a little liquor, and then Sir Francis narrated to her what had passed, dwelling upon the courage at which Phileas Fogg had not hesitated to risk his life to save her, and recounting the happy sequel of the venture. The result of Passepartout's rash idea, Mr. Fogg said nothing, while Passepartout, abashed, kept repeating that it wasn't worth telling. Iota pathetically thanked her deliverers, rather with tears than words. Her fine eyes interpreted her gratitude better than her lips. Then, as her thoughts strayed back to the scene of the sacrifice, and recalled the dangers which still menaced her, she shuddered with terror. Phileas Fogg understood what was passing in Iota's mind, and offered, in order to reassure her, to escort her to Hong Kong, where she might remain safely until the affair was hushed up. An offer she eagerly and gratefully accepted. She had, it seems, a posse relation, who was one of the principal merchants of Hong Kong, which is wholly an English city, based on an island in the Chinese coast. At 12:30 this train stopped at Benares. The Brahmin legends assert that this city is built on the site of an ancient Kasi, which, like Mahomet's tomb, was once suspended between heaven and earth, though the Benares of today, which all the Orientalists call the Athens of India, stands quite unpoetically on the solid earth. Passepartout caught glimpses of its brick houses and clay huts, giving an aspect of desolation to the place as the train entered it. Benares was Sir Francis Cromarty's destination, the troops he was rejoining being encamped some miles northward of the city. He bade adieu to Phileas Fogg, wishing him all success, and expressing the hope that he would come that way again in a less original but more profitable fashion. Mr. Fogg lightly pressed him by the hand. The parting of Iota, who did not forget that she owed Sir Francis, betrayed more warmth. As for Passepartout, he received a hearty shake of the hand from the gallant general. The railway, on leaving Benares, passed for a little while along the valley of the Ganges. Through the windows of the carriage the travellers had glimpses of the diversified landscape of Bihar, with its mountains clothed in verdure, its fields of barley, wheat, and corn, its jungles peopled with green alligators, its neat villages, and its thickly leaved forests. Elephants were bathing in the waters of the sacred river, and groups of Indians, despite the advanced season and chilly air, were performing solemnly their pious ablutions. These were fervent Brahmins, the bitterest foes of Buddhism, their deities being Vishnu, the solar god, Shiva, the divine impersonation of natural forces, and the Brahma, the supreme ruler of priests and legislators. What would these divinities think of India, anglicized as it is today, with steamers whistling and scuttling along the Ganges, frightening the gulls which float upon its surface, the turtles swarming along its banks, and the faithful dwelling upon its borders? The panorama passed before their eyes like a flash, save when the steam concealed it fitfully from the view. The travellers could scarcely discern the fort of Chupanay, 20 miles southwestward from Benares, the ancient stronghold of the Rajas of Bihar or Ghazipur, and from the famous rose water factories, or the tomb of Lord Cornwallis, resting on the left bank of the Ganges, the fortified town of Buxar or Patna, a large manufacturing and trading place, where is held the principal opium market of India, or Mongier, a more European town, for it is English, as Manchester or Birmingham, with black iron foundries, edge tool factories, and high chimneys puffing clouds of black smoke heavenward. Night came on. The train passed on at full speed, in the midst of a roaring of the tigers, bears, and wolves which fled before the locomotive, and the marbles of Bengal, Golconda, ruined Gore, Murshidabad, the ancient capital, Burdwan, Hujli, and the French town of Chandigarh, where Passepartout would have been so proud to see his country's flag flying, were hidden from their view in the darkness. Calcutta was reached at 7 in the morning, and the packet left for Hong Kong at noon, so that Phileas Fogg had 5 hours before him. According to his journal, he was due at Calcutta on the 25th of October, and that was the exact date of his actual arrival. He was therefore neither behindhand nor ahead of time. The 2 days' game between London and Bombay had been lost, as had been seen in the journey across India, but it is not supposed that Phileas Fogg regretted them. End of Chapter 14. Read by David Russell for Lit to Go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, Chapter 15, in which the bag of banknotes disgorges some thousands of pounds more. The train entered the station, and Passepartout, jumping out first, was followed by Mr. Fogg, who assisted his fair companion to descend. Phileas Fogg intended to proceed at once to the Hong Kong steamer, in order to get Iota comfortably settled for the voyage. He was unwilling to leave her while they were still on dangerous ground. Just as he was leaving the station, a policeman came up to him and said, "Mr. Phileas Fogg." "I am he." "Is this man your servant?" asked the policeman, pointing to Passepartout. "Yes." "Be so good, both of you, as to follow me." Mr. Fogg betrayed no surprise whatsoever. The policeman was a representative of the law, and the law is sacred to an Englishman. Passepartout tried to reason about the matter, but the policeman tapped him with his stick, and Mr. Fogg made a signal to obey. "May this young lady go with us?" asked he. "She may," replied the policeman. Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout were conducted into a palkigari, a sort of four-wheeled carriage drawn by two horses, in which they took their places and were driven away. No one spoke during the 20 minutes which elapsed before they reached their destination. They first passed through the Black Town, with its narrow streets and miserable dirty huts and the squalid population, then through the European town, which presented a relief in its bright brick mansions, shaded by cocoanut trees, and bristling with masts where, although it was early morning, elegantly dressed horsemen in handsome equipages were passing back and forth. The carriage stopped before a modest-looking house, which, however, did not have the appearance of a private mansion. The policeman, having requested his prisoners for so truly they might be so called to descend, conducted them into a room with barred windows, and said, "You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30. He then retired and closed the doors. "Why, we are prisoners!" exclaimed Passepartout, falling into a chair. Aouda, with an emotion she tried to conceal, said to Mr. Fogg, "Sir, you must leave me to my fate. It is on my account that you received this treatment. It is for having saved me." Phileas Fogg contented himself with saying that was impossible. It was quite unlikely that he should be arrested for preventing a suttee. The complainants would never dare present themselves with such a charge. There was some mistake. Moreover, he could not, in any event, abandon Aouda, but it would escort her to Hong Kong. "But the steamer leaves at noon," observed Passepartout nervously. "We shall be on board by noon," replied his master placidly. It was said so positively that Passepartout could not help but muttering to himself, "Parbleu, that's certain. Before noon we shall be on board." But he was no means reassured. At 8:30 the door opened. The policeman appeared, and requesting them to follow him, led the way to an adjoining hall. It was evidently a courtroom, and a crowd of Europeans and natives had already occupied the rear of the apartment. Mr. Fogg and his two companions took their places on a bench opposite the desks of the magistrate and his clerk. Immediately after, Judge Obadiah, a fat, round man, followed by the clerk, entered. He proceeded to take down a wig which was hanging on a nail, and put it hurriedly on his head.
"The first case,"
said he, then putting his hand to his head, exclaimed,
"Hey, this is not my wig."
"Now, your worship," returned the clerk, "it's mine."
"My dear Mr. Oysterpuff, how can a judge give a wise sentence in a clerk's wigs?"
The wigs were exchanged. Passepartout was getting nervous, for the hands on the face of the big clock over the judge seemed to go around with terrible rapidity.
"The first case,"
repeated Judge Obadiah. "Phileas Fogg?" demanded Oysterpuff. "I am here," replied Mr. Fogg. "Passepartout?" "Present," responded Passepartout.
"Good," said the judge. "You have been looked for, prisoners, for 2 days on the trains from Bombay."
"But of what are we accused?" asked Passepartout impatiently.
"You are about to be informed."
"I am an English subject, sir," said Mr. Fogg, "and I have the right—"
"Have you been ill-treated?"
"Not at all."
"Very well. Let the complainants come in."
A door was swung open by the order of the judge, and 3 Indian priests entered. "That's it," muttered Passepartout. "These are the rogues who are going to burn our young lady." The priests took their places in front of the judge, and clerk proceeded to read a loud voice a complaint of sacrilege against Phileas Fogg and his servant, who was accused of having violated a place held consecrated by the Brahmin religion.
"Do you hear the charge?"
"Yes, sir," replied Mr. Fogg, consulting his watch, "and I admit it."
"You admit it?"
"I admit it, and I wish to hear these priests admit it, in their turn, what they are going to do at the pagoda of the Pelagi." The priests looked at each other. They did not seem to understand what was said. "Yes," cried Passepartout warmly, "at the pagoda of the Pelagi, where they were on the point of burning their victim." The judge stared with astonishment, and the priests were stupefied.
"What victim?" said Judge Obadiah. "Burn whom? In Bombay itself?"
"Bombay?" cried Passepartout.
"Certainly. We're not talking of the pagoda at Pelagi, but of the pagoda at Mambar Hill at Bombay."
"And as a proof," added the clerk, "here are the desecrator's very shoes which he left behind him." Whereupon he placed a pair of shoes on his desk. "My shoes!" cried Passepartout, in his surprise permitting this imprudent exclamation to escape him. The confusion of master and man, who had quite forgotten the affair at Bombay for which they were now detained at Calcutta, may be imagined. Fix, the detective, had foreseen the advantage which Passepartout's escapade gave him, and, delaying his departure for 12 hours, had consulted the priests of Malabar Hill, knowing that the English authorities dealt very severely with this kind of misdemeanor. He promised them a goodly sum in damages, and sent them forward to Calcutta by the next train. Owing to the delay caused by the rescue of the young widow, Fix and the priest reached the Indian capital before Mr. Fogg and his servants. The magistrates, having already been warned by a dispatch to arrest them should they arrive, Fix's his disappointment when he learned that Phileas Fogg had not made his appearance in Calcutta may be imagined. He made up his mind had the robbers stopped somewhere on the route and taken refuge in the southern provinces. For 24 hours Fix watched the station with feverish anxiety. At last he was rewarded by seeing Mr. Fogg and Passepartout arrive, accompanied by a young woman, whose presence he was wholly at a loss to explain. He hastened for a policeman, and this was how the party came to be arrested and brought before Judge Obadiah. Had Passepartout been a little less preoccupied, he would have espied the detective ensconced in a corner of the courtroom, watching the proceedings with an interest easily understood, for the warrant had failed to reach him at Calcutta, as it had done in Bombay and Suez. Judge Obadiah had unfortunately caught Passepartout's rash exclamation, which the poor fellow would have given the world to recall. "The facts are admitted?" asked the judge. "Admitted," replied Mr. Fogg coldly. "It is much," resumed the judge, "as the English law protects equally sternly the religions of the Indian people, and as the man Passepartout has admitted that he violated the sacred pagoda of the Malabar Hill at Bombay on the 20th of October, I condemn the said Passepartout to imprisonment for 15 days and a fine of £300. £300! Cried Passepartout, startled at the largeness of the sum. "Silence!" shouted the constable. "And inasmuch," continued the judge, "it is not proved, and the act was not done by the connivance of the master with the servant, and as the master in any case must be held responsible for the acts of his paid servant, I condemn Phileas Fogg to a week's imprisonment and a fine of £150. Fix rubbed his hands softly with satisfaction. If Phileas Fogg could be detained in Calcutta for a week, it would be more than time for the warrant to arrive. Passepartout was stupefied. This sentence ruined his master. A wager of £20,000 lost because he, like a precious fool, had gone in that abominable pagoda. Phileas Fogg, as self-composed as if the judgment did not in the least concern him, did not even lift his eyebrows while it was being pronounced. Just as the clerk was calling the next case, he rose and said, "I offer bail." "You have that right," returned the judge. Fix's blood ran cold, but he resumed his composure when he heard the judge announce that the bail required for each prisoner would be £1,000. "I will pay it at once," said Mr. Fogg, taking a roll of bank bills from the carpet-bag which Passepartout had by him and placing them on the clerk's desk. "The sum will be restored to you upon your release from prison," said the jail. "Meanwhile, you are liberated on bail." "Come," said Phileas Fogg to a servant. "But let them at least give me my black shoes," cried Passepartout angrily. "Ah, these are pretty dear shoes," he muttered, as they were handed to him. "More than £1,000 apiece, besides. They pinch my feet." Mr. Fogg, offering his arm to Aouda, then departed, followed by the crestfallen Passepartout. Fix still nourished hopes that the robber would not, after all, leave the £2,000 behind him, but would decide to serve out his week in jail, and issued forth on Mr. Fogg's traces. That gentleman took a carriage, and the party were soon landed on one of the quays. The Rangoon was moored half a mile off in the harbour, its signal of departure hoisted at the masthead. 11 o'clock was striking. Mr. Fogg was an hour in advance of time. Fix saw them leave the carriage and push off in a boat for the steamer, and stamped his feet with disappointment. "The rascal is off after all," he exclaimed. £2,000 sacrificed. He's a prodigal as a thief. I'll follow him to the end of the world if necessary, but at the rate he's going on, his stolen money will soon be exhausted. The detective was not far wrong in making this conjecture. Since leaving London, what with travelling expenses, bribes, the purchase of an elephant, bails, and fines, Mr. Fogg had already spent more than £5,000 on the way, and the percentage of the sum recovered from the bank robber promised to the detectives was rapidly diminishing. End of Chapter 15. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days, by Jules Verne, Chapter 16, in which Fix does not seem to understand in the least what is said to him. The Rangoon, one of Peninsular and Oriental Company's boats plying in the Chinese and Japanese seas, was a screw steamer built of iron, weighing about 1,770 tons, and with engines of 400 horsepower. She was as fast, but not well fitted up, as the Mongolia, and Aouda was not comfortably provided for on board as Phileas Fogg would have liked. However, the trip from Calcutta to Hong Kong only comprised some 3,500 miles, occupying from 10 to 12 days, and the young woman was not difficult to please. During the first days of the journey, Aoda had become better acquainted with her protector, and constantly gave evidence of her deep gratitude for which he had done. The phlegmatic gentleman listened to her, apparently at least with coldness, neither his voice nor his manner betraying the slightest emotion, but he seemed to be always on the watch that nothing could be wanting to aid his comfort. He visited her regularly each day at certain hours, not so much to talk himself, but as to sit and hear her talk. He treated her with the strictest politeness, but with the precision of an automaton, the movements of which had been arranged for this purpose. Aoda did not quite know what to make of him, though. Passepartout had given her some hints of the master's eccentricity, and made her smile by telling her of the wager which was sending him around the world. After all, she owed Phileas Fogg her life, and she would always regard him through the exalting medium of her gratitude. Aoda confirmed that the Parsi's narrative of her touching history. She did indeed belong to the highest of the native races of India. Many of the Parsi merchants have made great fortunes there by dealing in cotton, and one of them, Sir Jamsty G.G. Hiboy, was a baronet of the English government. Aoda was a relative of this great man, and it was his cousin Gigi whom she hoped to join at Hong Kong. Whether she would find a protector in him she could not tell, but Mr. Fogg essayed to calm her anxieties, and to assure her that everything would be mathematically, he used the very word, arranged. Aoda fastened her great eyes, clear as the sacred lakes of the Himalaya, upon him, but the intractable Fogg, as reserved as ever, did not seem at all inclined to throw himself into this lake. The first few days of the voyage passed prosperously, amid favourable weather and propitious winds, and they soon came in sight of the great Andaman, the principal of the islands of the Bay of Bengal, with its picturesque saddle peak, 2,400 feet high, looming above the waters. The steamer passed along the shores, but the savage Papuans, who are in the lowest scale of humanity, but are not, as been asserted, cannibals, did not make their appearance. The panorama of the islands as they steamed by them was superb. Vast forests of palms, arcs, bamboo, teakwood, and of the giant mimosa and tree-like ferns covered the foreground, while behind the graceful outlines of the mountains were traced against the sky, and along the coast swarmed by thousands of the precious swallows, whose nest furnished a luxurious dish to the tables of the celestial empire. The varied landscape afforded by the Andaman Islands was soon passed, however, and the Rangoon rapidly approached the Straits of Malacca, which gave the access to the China Seas. What was Detective Fix, so unluckily drawn on from country to country, doing all this while? He had managed to embark on the Rangoon at Calcutta without being seen by Passepartout, after leaving orders that, if the warrant should arrive, it should be forwarded to him at Hong Kong, and he hoped to conceal his presence to the end of the voyage. It would have been difficult to explain why he was on board without awakening Passepartout's suspicions, who thought him still at Bombay, but necessity impelled him nevertheless to renew his acquaintance with the worthy servant, as will be seen. All the detective's hopes and wishes were now centered on Hong Kong, for the steamer's stay in Singapore would be too brief to enable him to take any steps there. The arrest must be made at Hong Kong, or the robber would probably escape him forever. Hong Kong was the last English ground on which he would set foot beyond China, Japan. America offered to Fogg a most certain refuge. If the warrant should at last make its appearance at Hong Kong, Fix could arrest him and give him to the hands of the local police, and there would be no further trouble. But beyond Hong Kong, a simple warrant would be of no avail. An extradition warrant would be necessary, and then would result in delays and obstacles, of which the rascal could have taken advantage of to elude justice. Fix thought these probabilities over during the long hours which he spent in his cabin, and kept repeating to himself, now either the warrant will be at Hong Kong, in which case I shall arrest my man, or it will not be there. And this time is it absolutely necessary that I should delay his departure. I have failed at Bombay, when I have failed at Calcutta. If I fail at Hong Kong, my reputation is lost. Cost what it may, I must succeed. But how shall I prevent his departure, if that should turn out to be my last resource? Fix made up his mind. If worst came to worst, he would make a confidant of Passepartout, and tell him what kind of fellow his master really was. That Passepartout was not Fogg's accomplice, he was very certain. The servant, enlightened by disclosure and afraid of being himself implicated in the crime, would doubtless become an ally of the detective. But this method was a dangerous one, only to be employed when everything else had failed. A word from Passepartout to his master would ruin it all. The detective was therefore a sore strait, but suddenly a new idea struck him. The presence of Aoda on the Rangoon in company with Phileas Fogg gave new material for reflection. Who was this woman? What combination of events had made her Fogg's travelling companion? Had they not evidently met somewhere between Bombay and Calcutta? But where? Had they met accidentally, or had Fogg gone into some interior purposeless quest of the charming damsel? Fix was fairly puzzled. He asked himself whether there had been not a wicked elopement, and this idea so impressed itself upon his mind that he was determined to make use of the supposed intrigue. Whether the young woman were married or not, he would be able to create such difficulties with Mr. Fogg at Hong Kong that he could not escape by paying any amounts of money. But he could even wait until they reached Hong Kong. Fogg had an abominable way of jumping from one boat to the other, and before anything could be effected, might get full under way for Yokohama. Fix decided that he must warn the English authorities and signal the Rangoon before her arrival. This was easy to do since the steamer stopped at Singapore, whence there was a telegraphic wire to Hong Kong. He finally resolved, moreover, before acting more positively, to question Passepartout. It would not be difficult to make him talk, as there was no time to lose. Fix prepared himself to make known. It was now the 30th of October, and on the day following the Rangoon was due at Singapore. Fix emerged from his cabin and went onto the deck. Passepartout was promenading up and down the forward part of the steamer. The detective rushed forward with every appearance of extreme surprise and exclaimed, "You here on the Rangoon?" "What, Monsieur Fix, are you on board?" returned the really astonished Passepartout, recognizing his crony of the Magnolia. "Why, I left you in Bombay, and here you are, on the way to Hong Kong. Are you going round the world, too?" No, replied Fix. "I shall stop at Hong Kong, at least for some days." Said Passepartout, who seemed for an instant perplexed. "But how it is I have not seen you on board since we left Calcutta." "Oh, a trifle of seasickness. I have been staying in my berth. The Gulf of Bengal does not agree with me as well as the Indian Ocean." "And how is Mr. Fogg?" "As well and as punctual as ever, and not a day behind time. But, Monsieur Fix, you don't know that we have a young lady with us." "A young lady?" replied the detective, not seeming to comprehend what was said. Passepartout thereupon recounted Aouda's history, the affair at the Bombay pagoda, the purchase of the elephant for £2,000, the rescue, the arrest and sentence of the Calcutta court, and the restoration of Mr. Fogg and himself to liberty on bail. Fix, who was familiar with the last events, seemed to be equally ignorant of all that Passepartout related. The lady was charmed to find so interested a listener. "But does your master propose to carry this young woman to Europe?" "Not at all. We are simply going to place her under the protection of one of her relatives, a rich merchant at Hong Kong." "Nothing to be done there," said Fix to himself, concealing his disappointment. "A glass of gin, Mr. Passepartout?" "Willingly, Monsieur Fix. We must at least have a friendly glass on board the Rangoon." End of Chapter 16. Read by David Russell. 4 lit to go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 17. Showing what happened on the voyage from Singapore to Hong Kong. The detective and Passepartout met often on deck after this interview. Though Fix was reserved and did not attempt to induce his companion to divulge any more facts concerning Mr. Fogg, he caught a glimpse of that mysterious gentleman once or twice, but Mr. Fogg usually confined himself to the cabin, where he kept Aouda company, or according to his inveterate habit, took a hand at whist. Passepartout began very seriously to conjecture what strange chance kept Fix still on the route that his master was pursuing. It was really worth considering why this certain very amiable, complacent person, whom he had first met in Suez, and then had encountered aboard the Mongolia, who disembarked at Bombay, which announced at his destination, now turned up so unexpectedly on the Rangoon, was following Mr. Fogg's track step by step. What was Fix's object? Passepartout was ready to wager his Indian shoes, which he religiously preserved, that Fix would also leave Hong Kong at the same time with them, and probably on the same steamer. Passepartout might have cudgelled his brain for a century without hitting upon the real object which the detective had in view. He could have never imagined that Phileas Fogg was being tracked as a robber around the globe. But as it is in human nature to attempt the solution of every mystery, Passepartout suddenly discovered an explanation of Fix's movements, which was in truth far from unreasonable. Fix, he thought, could only be an agent of Mr. Fogg's friends at the Reform Club, sent to follow him up, and ascertain that he really went around the world that has been agreed upon. "It's clear," repeated the worthy Silverman to himself, proud of his shrewdness. "He's a spy sent to keep us in view. That isn't quite the thing either, to be spying on Mr. Fogg, who is so honourable a man. Ah, gentlemen of the Reform, this shall cost you dear." Passepartout, enchanted with his discovery, resolved to say nothing to his master, lest he should be justly offended at the mistrust on part of his adversaries. But he determined to chaff Fix whenever he had the chance, with mysterious allusions which, however, need not betray his real suspicions. During the afternoon of Wednesday, 30th October, the Rangoon entered the Strait of Malacca, which separates the peninsula of that name from Sumatra. The mountainous and craggy islets intercepted the beauties of this noble land from the view of travellers. The Rangoon weighed anchor at Singapore the next day at 4 a.m. to receive coal, having gained a half-day on the prescribed time of her arrival. Phileas Fogg noted the gain in his journal, and then, accompanied by Aouda, who betrayed a desire for a walk on shore, disembarked. Fix, who suspected Mr. Fogg's every movement, followed them cautiously without being himself perceived, while Passepartout, laughing in at his sleeve at Fix's manoeuvres, went about his usual errands. The island of Singapore is not imposing in aspect, for there are no mountains, yet its appearance is not without attractions. It is a park checkered by pleasant highways and avenues. A handsome carriage, drawn by a sleek pair of New Holland horses, carried Phileas Fogg and Aouda into the midst of rose and palms with bright foliage and of clove trees, whereof the cloves formed the heart of a half-open flower. Pepper pans replaced the prickly hedges of European fields. Sago bushes, large ferns with gorgeous branches, varied the aspect of this tropical clime, while nutmeg trees in full foliage filled the air with a penetrating perfume. Agile and grinning bands of monkeys skipped about the trees, nor were tigers wanting in the jungles. After a drive of 2 hours through the country, Aouda and Mr. Fogg returned to the town, which is a vast collection of heavy-looking irregular houses, surrounded by charming gardens rich in tropical fruits and plants, and at 10 o'clock they re-embarked, closely followed by the detective, who had kept them constantly in sight. Passepartout, who had been purchasing several dozen mangoes, a fruit as large as good-sized apples of a dark brown color outside and a bright red within, and whose white pulp, melting in the mouth, affords gourmands a delicious sensation, was waiting for them on deck. He was only too glad to offer some mangoes to Aouda, who thanked him very gratefully for them. At 11 o'clock the Rangoon moored out of Singapore harbour, and in a few hours the high mountains of Malacca, with their forests, inhabited by the most beautifully furred tigers in the world, were lost to view. Singapore is distant some 1,300 miles from the island of Hong Kong, which is a little English colony near the Chinese coast. Phileas Fogg hoped to accomplish the journey in 6 days, so as to be home in time for the steamer which would leave on the 6th of November to Yokohama, the principal Japanese port. The Rangoon had a large quarter of passengers, many of whom disembarked at Singapore, among them a usual number of Indians, Ceylonese, Chinamen, Malays, and Portuguese, mostly second-class travellers. The weather, which had hitherto been fine, changed with the last quarter of the moon. The sea rolled heavily, and the wind at intervals almost rose to a storm, but happily blew from the southwest, and thus aided the steamer's progress. The captain, as often as possible, put up the sails, and under the double action of steam and sail, the vessel made rapid progress along the coasts of Annam and Cochin, China. Owing to the defective construction of the Rangoon, however, unusual precautions became necessary in unfavourable weather. But the loss of time which resulted from this cause, while it nearly drove Passepartout out of his senses, did not seem to affect his new master in the least. Passepartout blamed the captain, the engineer, and the crew, and consigned all who were connected with the ship to the land where the pepper grows. Perhaps the thought of gas, which was remorselessly burning at expense in Savile Row, had something to do with his hot impatience. "You're in a great hurry, then," said Fix to him one day, "to reach Hong Kong?" "A very great hurry. Mr. Fogg, I suppose, is anxious to catch the steamer for Yokohama. Terribly anxious. You believe in this journey around the world, then?" "Absolutely. Don't you, Mr. Fix?" "I don't believe a word of it." "You're a sly dog," said Passepartout, winking at him. The expression rather disturbed Fix, without his knowing why. Had the Frenchman guessed his real purpose? He knew not what to think, but how could Passepartout have discovered that he was a detective? Yet in speaking as he did, the man evidently meant more than he expressed. Passepartout still went further the next day. He could not hold his tongue. "Mr. Fix," he said in a bantering tone, "shall we be unfortunate as to lose you when we get to Hong Kong?" "Why," responded Fix, a little embarrassed, "I don't know. Perhaps. If you could only go all the way with us. An agent of the Peninsular Company, can't stop on the way. If we were only going to Bombay, and here you are in China, America is not far off, and from America to Europe is only a step." Fix looked intently at his companion, whose countenance was as serene as possible, and laughed with him, but Passepartout persisted in chaffing him by asking if he had made such by his recent occupation. "Yes and no," returned Fix. "There is good and bad luck in such things, but you must understand that I don't travel at my own expense." "Oh, I am quite sure of that," Passepartout cried heartily. Fix, fairly puzzled, descended to his cabin and gave himself up to his reflections. He was evidently suspected, somehow or the other, that the Frenchman had found out that he was a detective. But had he told his master? What part was he playing in all this? Was he an accomplice or not? Was the game then up? Fix spent several hours turning these over in his mind, sometimes thinking that all was lost, and persuading himself that Fogg was ignorant of his presence, and decided what course was best to take. Nevertheless, he preserved his coolness of mind, and at last resolved to deal plainly with Passepartout. If he did not find it practicable to arrest Fogg at Hong Kong, and if Fogg made preparations to leave that last foothold of English territory, he, Fix, would tell Passepartout all. Either the servant was the accomplice of his master, and in the case his master knew of his operations, and he should fail, or else the servant knew nothing about the robbery, then his interest would be to abandon the robber. Such was the situation between Fix and Passepartout. Meanwhile, Phileas Fogg moved about them in the most majestic and unconscious indifference. He was passing methodically in his orbit around the world, regardless of the lesser stars which gravitated around him. Yet there was near by which astronomers would call a disturbing star, which might produce an agitation in this gentleman's heart. But no, the charms of Aouda failed to act. To Passepartout's great surprise, and the disturbances, if they existed, would have been more difficult to calculate than those of Uranus which led to the discovery of Neptune. It was every day an increasing wonder to Passepartout, who read in Aouda's eyes the depth of her gratitude to his master. Phileas Fogg, though brave and gallant must be, he thought, quite heartless. As to the sentiment which this journey might have awakened in him, there is clearly no trace of such a thing, while poor Passepartout existed in perpetual reveries. One day he was leaning on the railing of the engine-room, and I was observing the engine when a sudden pitch of the steamer threw the screw out of the water, and the steam came hissing out of the valves. This made Passepartout indignant. "The valves are not sufficiently charged," he exclaimed. "We are not going. Oh, these English. If this was an American craft, we should blow up. Perhaps, but we should all events go faster." End of Chapter 17. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go, available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days, by Jules Verne, Chapter 18. In which Phileas Fogg, Passepartout, and Fix go each about his business. The weather was bad during the latter days of the voyage. The wind, abstainedly remaining in the northwest, blew a gale and retarded the steamer. The Rangoon rolled heavily with the passengers, who became impatient of the long monstrous waves which the wind raised before their path. A sort of tempest arose on the 3rd of November, the squall knocking the vessel about with fury, and the waves running high. The Rangoon reefed all her sails, and even the rigging proved too much, whistling and shaking amid the squall. The steamer was forced to proceed slowly, and the captain estimated that she would reach Hong Kong in 20 hours behind time, and more if the storm lasted. Phileas Fogg gazed at the tempestuous sea, which seemed to be struggling especially to delay him. With his habitual tranquillity, he never changed countenance for an instant, though a delay of 20 hours by making him too late for the Yokohama boat would most inevitably cause the loss of the wager, for this man had a nerve manifested neither in impatience nor annoyance. It seemed as if the storm were part of his program and had been foreseen. Aouda was amazed to find him calm as he had been from the first time she saw him. Fix did not look at the state of things in the same light. The storm greatly pleased him. His satisfaction would have been complete had the Rangoon been forced to retreat before the violence of wind and waves. Each delay filled him with hope, for it became more and more probable that Fogg would be obliged to remain some days at Hong Kong, and now the heavens themselves became his allies. With the gusts and squalls, it mattered not that they made him seasick. He made no account of this inconvenience, and whilst the body was writhing under the effects, his spirit bounded with hopeful exultation. Passepartout was arranged beyond expression at the unprecipitous weather. Everything had gone so well till now. Earth and sea had seemed to be at his master's service. Steamers and railways obeyed him. Wind and steam united to speed his journey. Had the hour of adversity come, Passepartout was as much excited as if the £20,000 were to come from his own pocket. The storm exasperated him. Gale made him furious. How he longed to lash the obstinate sea into obedience. Poor fellow. Fix carefully concealed from his own satisfaction, for he had betrayed it. Passepartout could scarcely have restrained himself from personal violence. Passepartout remained on deck as long as the tempest lasted, being unable to remain quiet below and taking it to his head to aid the progress of the ship by lending a hand with the crew. He overwhelmed the captain, officers, and sailors who could not help laughing at his impatience with all sorts of questions. He wanted to know exactly how long the storm was going to last, whereupon he referred to the barometer, which seemed to have no intent of rising. Passepartout shook it, but with no perceivable effect, for neither shaking nor maledictions could prevail upon it to change its mind. On the 4th, however, the sea became more calm, and the storm lessened its violence. The wind reared southward and was once more favorable. Passepartout cleared up with his weather, some of the sails were unfurled, and the Rangoon resumed its most rapid speed. The time lost could not, however, be regained. Land was not signaled until 5 o'clock on the morning of the 6th. The steamer was due on the 5th. Phileas Fogg was 24 hours behindhand, and the Yokohama steamer would, of course, be missed. The pilot went on board at 6 and took his place on the bridge to guide the Rangoon through the channels of the port of Hong Kong. Passepartout longed to ask him if the steamer had left for Yokohama, but he dared not, for he wished to preserve the spark of hope, which still remained until the last moment. He had confided his anxiety to Fix, who, the sly rascal, tried to console him by saying that Mr. Fogg would be in time if he took the next boat, but this only put Passepartout in a passion. Mr. Fogg, bolder than his servant, did not hesitate to approach the pilot, and tranquilly asked him if he knew whether a steamer would leave Hong Kong for Yokohama. "At high tide tomorrow morning," answered the pilot. "Ah," said Mr. Fogg without betraying any astonishment. Passepartout, who had heard what passed, would willingly have embraced the pilot, while Fix would have been glad to twist his neck. "What is the steamer's name?" asked Mr. Fogg. "The Carnatic." "Ought she not to have gone yesterday?" "Yes, sir, but they had to repair one of her boilers, so her departure was postponed till tomorrow." "Thank you," returned Mr. Fogg, descending mathematically to the saloon. Passepartout clasped the pilot's hands and shook it heartily in his delight, exclaiming, "Pilot, you are the best of good fellows." The pilot probably does not know to this day why his responses won him the enthusiastic greeting. He remounted the bridge and guided the steamer through the flotilla of junks, tankers, and fishing boats which crowd the harbor of Hong Kong. At 1 o'clock the Rangoon was in the quay, and the passengers were going ashore. Chance had strangely favored Phileas Fogg, for he had not the Carnatic been forced to lie over for repairing her boilers, she would have left on the 6th of November, and the passengers for Japan would have been obliged to wait for a week in the sailing of the next steamer. Mr. Fogg was, it is true, 24 hours behind his time, but could not seriously imperil the remainder of his tour. The steamer which crossed the Pacific from Yokohama to San Francisco made a direct connection with that from Hong Kong, and it could not sail until the latter reached Yokohama. If Mr. Fogg was 24 hours late on reaching Yokohama, this time would no doubt be easily regained on the voyage of 22 days across the Pacific. He found himself, then, about 24 hours behindhand, 35 days after leaving London. The Carnatic was announced to leave Hong Kong at 5 the next morning. Mr. Fogg had 16 hours into which to attend to his business there, which was to deposit Aouda safely with her wealthy relative. On landing, he conducted her to a palanquin, in which they repaired to the Club Hotel, a room that was engaged for the young woman, and Mr. Fogg, after seeing that she wanted for nothing, set out in search of her cousin Gigi. He instructed Passepartout to remain at the hotel until his return, and that Aouda may not be left entirely alone. Mr. Fogg repaired to the Exchange, where he did not doubt everyone would know so wealthy and considerable a personage as the Parsee merchant. Meeting a broker he made inquiry to learn that Gigi had left China 2 years before, and retiring from business with an immense fortune, had taken up his residence in Europe. In Holland, the broker thought, with the merchants of which country he had principally traded. Phileas Fogg returned to his hotel, begged a moment of conversation with Aouda, and without more ado apprised her that Gigi was no longer in Hong Kong, but probably in Holland. Aouda at first said nothing. She passed her hand across her forehead and reflected a few moments. Then her sweet, soft voice, she said, "What are I to do, Mr. Fogg?" "It's very simple," responded the gentleman. "Go on to Europe. But I cannot intrude. You do not intrude, nor do you at least embarrass my project. Passepartout, monsieur, go to the Carnatic and engage 3 cabins." Passepartout, delighted that the young woman, who was very gracious to him, was going to continue the journey with him, went off in a brisk gait to obey his master's order. End of chapter 18. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, Chapter 19, in which Passepartout takes too great an interest in his master and what comes of it. Hong Kong is an island which came into the possession of the English by the Treaty of Nankin after the War of 1842, and the colonizing genius of the English had created upon an important city and an excellent port. The island is situated at the mouth of the Canton River, and it is separated by about 60 miles from the Portuguese town of Malacca, on the opposite coast. Hong Kong has beaten Malacca in the struggle for Chinese trade, and now the greater part of the transportation of Chinese goods finds a depot at the former place. Docks, hospitals, wharves, a Gothic cathedral, a government house, macadamized streets give to Hong Kong the appearance of a town in Kent or Surrey transferred by some strange magic to the Antipodes. Passepartout wandered with his hands in his pockets towards the Victoria port, and gazing as he went at the curious palanquins and other modes of conveyance, and the groups of Chinese, Japanese, and Europeans who passed to and fro in the streets, Hong Kong seemed not to unlike Bombay, Calcutta, and Singapore, since, like them, it betrayed everywhere the evidence of English supremacy. At the Victoria port he found a confused mass of ships of all nations, English, French, American, and Dutch men-of-war trading vessels, Japanese and Chinese junks, sempas, tankas, and flower boats, which formed so many floating parterres. Passepartout noticed in the crowd a number of the natives, who seemed very old and were dressed in yellow. On going into a barber's to get shaved, he learned that these ancient men were at least 80 years old, at which age they are permitted to wear yellow, which is the imperial color. Passepartout, without exactly knowing why, thought this was very funny. Upon reaching the quay where they were to embark in the Carnatic, he was not astonished to find Fix walking up and down. The detective seemed much disturbed and disappointed. "This is bad," muttered Passepartout, "for the gentleman of the Reform Club." He accosted Fix with a merry smile, as if he had not perceived the gentleman's chagrin. The detective had indeed good reasons to inveigh and invest in the bad luck which pursued him. The warrant had not come. It was certainly on its way, but it certainly would not reach Hong Kong for several days, and this being the last English territory on Mr. Fogg's route, the robber would escape unless he could manage to detain him. "Well, Monsieur Fix," said Passepartout, "have you decided to go with us so far as America?" "Yes," returned Fix through his set teeth. "Good!" exclaimed Passepartout, laughing heartily. "I knew you could not persuade yourselves to separate from us. Come and engage your berth." They entered the steamer office and secured cabins for 4 persons. The clerk, as he gave them the tickets, informed them that the repairs on the Carnatic having been completed, the steamer would leave that very evening, and not next morning as had been announced. "That will suit my master all the better," said Passepartout. "I will go and let him know." Fix now decided to make a bold move. He resolved to tell Passepartout all. It seemed to be the only possible means of keeping Phileas Fogg several days longer at Hong Kong. He accordingly invited his companion to a tavern which caught on the eye of the quay. Upon entering, they found themselves in a large room handsomely decorated, at the end of which was a large camp bed furnished with cushions. Several persons lay upon this bed in a deep sleep. At the small tables which were arranged around the room, some 30 customers were drinking English beer, porter, gin, and brandy, smoking, the while long red clay pipes stuffed with little balls of opium mingled with the essence of rose. From time to time, one of the smokers, overcome with the narcotic, would slip under the table, whereupon the waiters, taking him by the head and feet, carried him and laid him upon the bed. The bed already supported 20 of these stupefied salts. Fix and Passepartout saw that they were in the smoking-house, haunted by those wretched, cadaverous, idiotic creatures to whom the English merchants sell every year the miserable drug called opium, to the amount of £1,400,000. Thousands devoted to the most despicable vices which afflict humanity. The Chinese government has a vain attempt to deal with the evil by stringent laws. It passed gradually from the rich, to whom it was at first exclusively reserved, to the lower classes, and then its ravages could not be arrested. Opium is smoked everywhere, all the times, by men and women. The celestial empire, and once accustomed to it, the victims cannot dispense with it, except by suffering horrible bodily contortions and agonies. A great smoker can smoke as many as 8 pipes a day, but he dies in 5 years. It was in one of these dens that Fix and Passepartout, in search of a firm of glass, found themselves. Passepartout had no money, but willingly accepted Fix's invitation out of hope of returning the obligation in some future time. They ordered 2 bottles of port, to which the Frenchman did ample justice, while Fix observed him with close attention. They chatted about the journey, and Passepartout was especially merry at the idea that Fix was going to continue it with him. When the bottles were empty, however, he rose to go and tell his master of the change in the time and the sailing of the Carnatic. Fix caught him by the arm. "Wait a moment." "What for, Mr. Fix? I want to have a serious talk with you." "A serious talk?" cried Passepartout, drinking up a little wine that was left in the bottom of his glass. "Well, we'll talk about it tomorrow. I haven't time now." "Stay. What I have to say concerns your master." Passepartout at this looked attentively at his companion. Fix's face seemed to have a singular expression. He resumed his seat. "What have you to say?" Fix placed his hand upon Passepartout's arms, and lowering his voice said, "You have guessed who I am." "Parbleu," said Passepartout, smiling. "Then I'm going to tell you everything, now that I know everything, my friend." "Ah, that's very good. But go on. First, let me tell you that these gentlemen have put themselves to a useless expense." "Useless," said Fix. "You speak confidently. It's clear you don't know how large the sum is." "Of course I do," returned Passepartout. £20,000. "55,000, answered Fix, pressing his companion's hands. "What?" cried the Frenchman. "Had Monsieur Fogg dared? £55,000! Well, there's all the more reason for not losing an instant," he continued, getting up hastily. Fix pushed Passepartout back in his chair and resumed. £55,000, and if I succeed, I'll get £2,000. If you'll help me, I'll let you have 500 of them. "Help you?" cried Passepartout, whose eyes were standing wide open. "Yes, help me keep Mr. Fogg here for 2 or 3 more days." "Why, what are you saying? These gentlemen are not satisfied with following my master, and suspecting his honor, they must try to put obstacles in his way? I blush for them." "What do you mean?" "I mean this is a piece of shameful trickery. They might as well waylay Mr. Fogg and put his money in their pockets. That's just what we count on doing." "It's a conspiracy, then," cried Passepartout, became more and more excited as the liquor mounted in his head, for he drank without perceiving it. "A real conspiracy, and gentlemen too. Bah!" Fix began to be puzzled. "Members of the Reform Club," continued Passepartout, "you must know, Monsieur Fix, that my master is an honest man, and that when he makes a wager he tries to win it fairly." "But who do you think I am?" asked Fix, looking at him intently. "Parbleu, an agent of the members of the Reform Club, sent here to interrupt my master's journey." "But I thought I found you out some time ago. I've taken good care to say nothing about it to Mr. Fogg." "He knows nothing, then?" "Nothing," replied Passepartout, again emptying a glass. The detective passed his hands across his forehead, hesitating before he spoke again. What should he do? Passepartout's mistake seemed sincere, but it has made his design more difficult. It was evident that the servant was not the master's accomplice, as Fix had been inclined to suspect. "Well," said the detective to himself, "as he is not his accomplice, he will help me." He had no time to lose. Fogg must be detained at Hong Kong, so resolved to make a clean breast of it. "Listen to me. I am, as not as you think, an agent of the members of the Reform Club." "Bah!" retorted Passepartout with an air of raillery. "I'm a police detective sent out here by a London office. You a detective? I will prove it. Here's my commission." Passepartout was speechless with astonishment when Fix displayed his document, the genuineness of which could not be doubted. "Mr. Fogg's wager," resumed Fix, "is only a pretext of which you and the gentlemen of the Reform are dupes. He had a motive for securing your innocent complicity. But why? Listen. On the 28th of September, a robbery of £55,000 was committed at the Bank of England by a person whose description was unfortunately secured. Here is his description. It answers exactly to that of Mr. Phileas Fogg." "What nonsense!" cried Passepartout. "My master is the most honourable of men." "How can you tell? You know scarcely anything about him. You went into his service the day he came away, and he came away on a foolish pretext, without trunks and carrying a large amount in banknotes. And yet you are bold enough to assert that he is an honest man?" Yes, repeated the poor fellow melancholy. "Would you like to be arrested as accomplice?" Passepartout, overcome by what he had heard, held his head between his hands and did not dare look at the detective. Phileas Fogg, the saviour of Eota, that brave and generous man, a robber. And yet how many presumptions there were against him. Passepartout essayed to reject the suspicions which forced themselves upon his mind. He did not wish to believe his master was guilty. "Well, what do you want of me?" He said it with an effort. "See here, I have tracked Mr. Fogg to this place, but I have yet to fail to receive the warrant of arrest for which I have sent to London. You must help me to keep him here in Hong Kong. But I will share you with the £2,000 reward offered by the Bank of England." "Never," replied Passepartout, who tried to rise but fell back, exhausted in mind and body. "Mr. Fix," he stammered, "even what you should say is true. My master is really the robber you are seeking, which I deny. I am in his service. I have seen his generosity and his goodness, and I will never betray him, not for all the gold in the world. I come from a village where they don't eat that kind of bread. You refuse? I refuse. Consider that I had said nothing," said Fix, "and let us drink. Yes, let us drink." Passepartout felt himself yielding more and more to the effects of the liquor. Fix, seeing that he must at all hazards be separated from his master, wished to entirely overcome him. Some pipes full of opium lay on the table. Fix slipped one into Passepartout's hands. He took it, put it between his lips, lit it, and drew several puffs, and his head, becoming very heavy under the influence of the narcotic, fell upon the table. "At last," said Fix, seeing Passepartout unconscious. "Mr. Fogg will not be informed of his Carnatic's departure, and if he is, he will have to go on without his cursed Frenchman." And after paying his bill, Fix left the tavern. End of Chapter 19. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go, available on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Around the World in 80 Days, by Jules Verne. Chapter 20, in which Fix comes face to face with Phileas Fogg. While these events were passing at the opium house, Mr. Fogg, unconscious of the danger he was in losing the steamer, was quietly escorting Aouda about the streets of the English quarter, making necessary purchases for the long voyage before them. It was all very well for an Englishman like Mr. Fogg to make the tour of the world with a carpet-bag. A lady could not be expected to travel comfortably in such conditions. He acquitted his task with characteristic serenity, and invariably replied to the remonstrances of his fair companion, who was confused by his patience and generosity. "It is in the interest of my money, a part of my programme." The purchases made, they returned to the hotel, where they dined at a sumptuously served table d'hôte, after which Aouda, shaking hands with the protector of the English fashion, retired to her room for a rest. Mr. Fogg absorbed himself throughout the evening in the perusal of the Times and Illustrated London News. Had he been capable of astonished at anything, he would not have seen his servant return at bedtime, but knowing that his steamer was not to leave for Yokohama until the next morning, he did not disturb himself about the matter. When Passepartout did not appear the next morning to answer his master's bell, Mr. Fogg, not betraying the least vexation, contented himself with taking his carpet-bag, calling Aouda, and sending for a palanquin. It was then 8 o'clock. At 9:30, it being then high tide, the Carnatic would leave the harbour. Mr. Fogg and Aouda got into the palanquin, their luggage being brought after on a wheelbarrow. A half-hour later stepped up on the quay whence they were to embark. Mr. Fogg then learned that the Carnatic had sailed the evening before. He had expected to find not only the steamer but his domestic, and was forced to give up both. But no sign of disappointment appeared on his face, and he merely remarked to Aouda, "It is an accident, madam, nothing more." At this moment a man who had been observing him attentively approached. It was Fix, who, bowing, addressed Mr. Fogg. "Were you not, like me, sir, a passenger on the Rangoon which arrived yesterday?" "I was, sir," replied Mr. Fogg coldly, "but I have not had the honour." "Pardon me, I thought you'd only find your servant here." "Do you know where he is, sir?" "What?" responded Fix, feigning surprise. "Is he not with you?" "No, he has not made his appearance since yesterday." "Could he have gone on board the Carnatic without us?" "Without you, madame," answered the detective. "Excuse me, did you intend to sail the Carnatic?" "Yes, I did." "So did I, madam. I am excessively disappointed. The Carnatic, its repairs being completed, left Hong Kong 12 hours before the stated time, without any notice being given, and we now must wait a week for another steamer." As he said a week, Fix felt his heart leap for joy. Fogg detained at Hong Kong for a week. There would be time for the warrant to arrive, and fortune at last favoured the representative of the law. His horror may be imagined when he heard Mr. Fogg say in his placid voice, "For there are other vessels besides the Carnatic, it seems to me, in the harbour of Hong Kong." And offering his arm to Aouda, he directed his steps toward the dock in search of some craft about to start. Fix, stupefied, followed. It seemed as if he were really attached to Mr. Fogg by an invisible thread. Chance, however, appeared really to have abandoned the man, and it hitherto served so well. For 3 hours Phileas Fogg wandered about the docks, with the determination, if necessary, to charter a vessel to carry him to Yokohama, but he could only find vessels which were loading or unloading, and which would not, therefore, set sail. Fix began to hope again, but Mr. Fogg, far from being discouraged, was continuing his search, resolved not to stop if he had to resort to Macao, when he was accosted by a sailor on one of the wharves. "Is your honour looking for a boat?" "Have you a boat ready to sail?" "Yes, your honour, a pilot boat, number 43, the best in the harbour. Does she go fast? Between 8 and 9 knots the hour. Will you look at her?" "Yes." "Your honour will be satisfied with her. Is it for a sea excursion?" "No, for a voyage." "A voyage?" "Yes. Will you agree to take me to Yokohama?" The sailor leaned on the rating, opened his eyes wide, and said, "Is your honor joking?" "No, I have missed the Carmatic, and I must get to Yokohama by the 14th at the latest, to take the boat for San Francisco." "I am sorry," said the sailor, "but it is impossible. I offer you £100 per day, and an additional reward of £200 if I reach the Yokohama in time. Are you in earnest?" "Very much so." The pilot walked away a little distance, gazed out to sea, evidently struggling between the anxiety to earn a large sum and the fear of venturing so far. Fix was in mortal suspense. Mr. Fogg turned to Ada and asked her, "You would not be afraid, would you, madam?" "Not with you, Mr. Fogg," was her answer. The pilot now returned, shuffling his hat in his hands. "Well, pilot," said Mr. Fogg. "Well, your honor," replied he, "I could not risk myself, my men, or my little boat of scarcely 20 tons on so long a voyage at this time of year. Besides, we could not reach Yokohama in time, for it is 1,660 miles from Hong Kong." "Only 1,600, said Mr. Fogg. "It's the same thing." Fix breathed more freely. "But," added the pilot, "it might be arranged another way." Fix ceased to breathe at all. "How?" asked Mr. Fogg. "By going to Nagasaki, at the extreme south of Japan, or even to Shanghai, which is only 800 miles from here. In going to Shanghai, we could not be forced to sail the wide of the Chinese coast, which would be a great advantage, as the currents run northward and would aid us." "Pilot, I must make the American steam at Yokohama and not at Shanghai or Nagasaki." "Why not?" returned the pilot. "The San Francisco does not start from the Yokohama. It puts in at Yokohama and Nagasaki, but starts from Shanghai." "You are sure of that?" "Perfectly." "And when does the boat leave Shanghai?" "On the 11th at 7 in the evening. We therefore have 4 days before us. That is 96 hours, and in that time, if we have good luck and a southwest wind, and the sea was calm, we could make those 800 miles to Shanghai, and you could go in an hour. As soon as provisions got aboard on the ship and the sails put up. It is a bargain. Are you the master of the boat?" "Yes. John Busby, master of the Tankard." "Would you like some earnest money?" "If it would not put your honor out. Here are £200 on the account, sir," added Phileas Fogg, turning to Fix. "If you would like to take advantage—" "Thanks, sir. I was about to ask the favor." "Very well, and in half an hour we shall go on board. But poor Passepartout," urged Aouda, who was much disturbed by the servant's disappearance. "I shall do all I can to find him." All Fix, in a feverish, nervous state, repaired to the pilot boat. The others directed their course to the police station at Hong Kong. Phileas Fogg there gave Passepartout's description and left a sum of money to be spent on the search. For him, the same formalities have been gone through the French consulate, and the palanquin have stopped at the hotel for luggage, which have been sent back there. They returned to the wharf. It was now 3 o'clock, and pilot boat number 43, with its crew on board and its provisions stored away, was ready for departure. The Tankard was a neat little craft of 20 tons, as gracefully built as if she were a racing yacht. Her shining copper sheathing, her galvanized ironwork, and her deck, white as ivory, betrayed the pride taken by John Busby in making her presentable. Her 2 masts leaned a trifle backward. She carried a brigantine, 4-sail, storm jib, standing jib, and was well rigged for running before the wind. And she seemed capable of brisk speed, which indeed she had already proved by gaining several prizes in pilot boat races. The crew of the Tankard were composed of John Busby, the master, 4 hardy mariners who were familiar with the Chinese seas, John Busby himself, a man over 45 thereabouts, vigorous, sunburnt, with the sprightly expression of the eye and energetic, self-reliant countenance, would have inspired confidence in the most timid. Phileas Fogg and Aouda went on board. Where they found Fix already installed below deck was a square cabin, of which the walls bulged out in the form of cots, above a circular divan. In the center was a table provided with a swinging lamp. The accommodation was confined but neat. "I'm sorry I have nothing better to offer you," said Mr. Fogg to Fix, who bowed without responding. The detective had a feeling akin to humiliation in profiting by the kindness of Mr. Fogg. "It is certain," thought he, "though rascal he is a polite one." The sails in the English flag were hoisted 10 minutes past 3. Mr. Fogg and Aouda, who were seated on the desk, cast a last glance at the quay in hopes of espying Passepartout. Fix was not within his fears lest chance should direct the steps of the unfortunate servant whom he had so badly treated in this direction, in which a case explanation of the reverse of satisfactory due to the detective must have ensued, but the Frenchman did not appear, and without doubt was still lying under the stupefying influence of opium. John Busby, master, at length gave the order to start, and the Tankard, taking on the wind of her brigantine, 4-sail and standing jib, bounded briskly forward over the waves. End of Chapter 20. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu.